Today's topic is about how Californians respond to wildfire smoke. And before I talk specifically about that project, sorry. There we go. Talk a little bit about my background and how both my personal and professional experiences influenced my interests broadly in graduate school, and then also specifically how I was led to study this topic of wildfire smoke and wildfire smoke response. So I was born in California, actually not far from here in San Jose, and I lived for a number of years in a town called Paradise. So you all have probably heard about Paradise. It was actually the center of the Camp Fire in 2018, and it was almost entirely destroyed. And the reason I wanted to bring this up at the beginning is this really was a big part of why I decided to conduct this study and why I was interested in understanding more about how people respond to wildfire smoke. I do some other research in other sectors, but my experiences growing up in Paradise really sort of encouraged this interest. And I also lived in a place called the Sea Ranch in Northern California. And so this was all before I was 10 years old. Moved a bit in Northern California. And the Sea Ranch is north of here. And this really influenced my interest in coastal marine places. And then finally, I moved to Vermont when I was 10 years old. And I think my experiences in Vermont really sort of instilled in me an ethic to care about the environment. And I saw there a lot of communities and people who were really proactive about protecting the environment. And so that experience in particular has led me to sort of my general topic of interest. And so just a little bit of background, I studied American history in college and thought for a while I might go and be a lawyer. But I sort of changed my mind and thought I wanted to work in policy in the environmental space. So I worked for a number of years for different NGOs, including Earth Justice, which is actually a law firm that does a lot of work around environmental issues. And then I went back and got a master's degree. My plan was to go back into the professional world and continue to advocate for environmental issues. But it was there that I really found my love for teaching and for research. And so I worked again for a little bit in the NGO and government sector, and then was very lucky to land here at Stanford in EIPER, where I was able to kind of craft my own course of study. And specifically, I use sort of theories and methods from sociology, social psychology, and decision science. So really all disciplines that are trying to understand how people behave in both groups and as individuals. And sort of broadly, I studied the lived experiences of people in dramatically changing places. And also, I'm very interested in how our social world influences our response to climate change. So how the people around us, the experiences in our communities, impact how we respond and potentially how we adapt to environmental change and risk. And so this study and some of my other work really looks at the social and psychological processes that individuals and groups go through to respond to these types of environmental changes and risk. So some of my other work, which I'd be happy to answer questions about at the end of the talk, is focused in southeastern Louisiana, where I study community response and mobility in response to land loss and restoration efforts. And I also study resident and tourist perceptions of coral reef health in Hawaii. So these interests, again, sort of grew out of my experiences living on the coast in Northern California, really having a love of the ocean and marine environments, and it's very much the focus of my dissertation until 2018, when the Camp Fire ravaged through Paradise. And I had this conversation with my friend and colleague in EIPER, and he is an epidemiologist. He studies air quality and public health, and he also grew up in California. And we were talking about how we just felt like we didn't know what to do, even ourselves. We were here at Stanford. We didn't know how to respond. We didn't know exactly what the right things were to do to protect our own health from wildfire smoke. And in particular, there were people who were living very close to Paradise, sort of in the inland region, who were being exposed to really massive and dangerous levels of smoke and particulate matter. And so we decided to work together to form this project. And it sort of blends his interest in public health and epidemiology, which is really tracking how exposure impacts health, and on my side of things, really trying to understand how people behave in certain situations, how people respond to environmental, social, and sort of psychological cues that influence their behavior. So again, the motivation for this project really was this sort of local experience of living in the wildfire smoke plume myself and seeing my friends and family live through it as well. And then also just sort of this understanding more regionally and globally that wildfires are expected to become more intense and frequent in the future due to climate change. And we're seeing now in the news terrible, devastating fires in Australia, also most likely driven by climate change impacts. And again, so this exposure to wildfire smoke really poses severe health risks. Wildfire smoke coming from structures that were burned contain all sorts of toxins that are even worse than wildfires that are in sort of open wild lands. And they're very dangerous to vulnerable groups like the elderly, children, and people who have chronic health issues. And ultimately, we have a fairly limited understanding of how people respond. And part of this, I think, is because wildfires haven't been quite so frequent and haven't been such a looming issue for people until very recently. So the study's aims really are to kind of get a grounded and rich understanding of people's experiences during a wildfire smoke event. And so the first goal is to explore these themes related to these experiences, and we are using what's called a case study, an extreme case, case study of an extreme case, which is the 2018 Camp Fire. So this is just a method of sort of focusing on one event that was very severe to try to explore and observe these experiences and protective health decisions that people made. And then also to describe the way that people made decisions. So again, how they used information, environmental, and social cues. And then finally to potentially identify differences between how people responded based on their social vulnerability, their social support and resources, and their chronic exposure to PM 2.5. So PM 2.5 is particulate matter, and it's often produced by car emissions, and it's very dangerous to your respiratory health. And so we were very interested in understanding how people who were exposed long-term to poor air quality responded to wildfire smoke compared to people who maybe lived in places where the air was usually pretty good. So our research approach is actually multiple steps, and I'm going to just be focusing on the first phase, which is a qualitative study that conducted about 30, well, our goal is to conduct 35 to 40 interviews, and to analyze that data to find sort of important themes and topics that we can use to refine and then develop a survey. So the survey will ideally be rolled out later this year, and I can talk a little bit more about that at the end of the talk, but again, this first phase of work, this qualitative work, the goal is to inform the development of a survey and also provide sort of a standalone set of findings that can be used potentially for policymakers and also for other researchers. So our goal was to interview people who were exposed to the wildfire smoke, but also we wanted to create some diversity in that group by also selecting for people who lived in places with chronic PM 2.5 exposure and places where they were not exposed. So we conducted interviews with folks in Fresno, and this is a place where pretty poor air quality year-round. And then we also conducted interviews in Sacramento and locally here in East Palo Alto. And Sacramento and East Palo Alto actually have pretty decent air quality most of the year. And this is just a map sort of showing the mean annual PM 2.5 concentration. So this is how exposed people are to poor air quality throughout the year. And this is a snazzy graphic that my colleague produced showing the smoke plume of the campfire over the course of the approximately 2 weeks that it was going. And you can see that where we've interviewed people really is sort of in this focal area of Northern California where the smoke was the most severe. So this has a lot on it, but I wanted to just show it to you because this is how we, as researchers, developed the interview protocol. So in order to go and ask people questions about their responses to wildfire smoke, we needed to think about the specific topics that we would ask them about. And myself and the team of researchers that I work with developed this framework. And this is based off of a few other theories of behavior. And you can see that it has, as I mentioned before, the environmental, social, and informational cues that we expect people use to inform their decisions. We also ask about questions related to perceptions. And finally, we're interested in the type of actions and behaviors that really resulted from this. So the types of questions that we asked in our interviews related to things like people's sense of place, their connection to where they lived, and their perceptions of their baseline air quality exposure. So their own perceptions of how bad the air is year-round where they live. We also asked them questions about their knowledge of fire seasons, when they think they begin and end, and their previous experiences with wildfires and wildfire smoke. So in this sort of set of questions was really meant to get at people's past experiences, their memories, and how that might influence how they interpret information and make decisions in a wildfire smoke event. And we asked them specifically about their experiences before and during the campfire related to the environment. So we asked them what they smelled, tasted, and were able to see related to the wildfire smoke. And also we asked them a lot about the types of social cues that they were noticing. So were other people coughing? Were other people wearing masks? What did their friends and family talk about during the wildfire smoke event? We asked them a lot about the types of decisions that they might have made to actually mitigate their exposure to wildfire smoke. So we asked them about the information sources that they used. Did they go online? Did they go to the news, maybe on TV? And how much did they trust those information sources? We also asked them about the air quality index. So this is a tool that's used by public health officials to describe the quality of the air. And we really wanted to see if people were using this tool and if they understood what it meant. And finally, we asked about the types of social support that they received and the helping behaviors that they were able to do in their communities to help other people deal with wildfire smoke. And finally, we asked them a little bit about the future. So the types of actions that they wish they had taken, that they plan to take in the future. So we really wanted to understand how their experiences with this very severe event might impact how they would behave in the future. If they were making plans to, say, stock up on masks, buy a filter, other things like that. So our sample so far is 31 participants, and we're still in the process of interviewing a few more people. 7 of them live in households with children, so that gave us some really interesting data about how people were thinking about the health of the children in their homes and if they were doing specific things to protect their children. Median age was about 45, and we did our best to get sort of a diverse group of participants, and we're going to continue to try to interview more people. In particular, our goal is to interview a handful of Spanish speakers because in the Fresno area there are a lot of Spanish speakers there who work outdoors, and we really wanted to ensure that our sample captured that particular experience. So I'll talk a little bit about our early findings. So we are sort of in this stage now where we're at the end of our interviewing. We have a handful more interviews to do, and we're in the process of coding and analyzing these interviews for emerging themes that can help us, again, really sort of focus on the types of topics we may want to ask about in a survey in the future. And then also to really do justice to the people that we interviewed, to try to summarize and synthesize the experiences and reports that they gave us about how they dealt with wildfire smoke. So I'll talk a little bit about what I'm calling distrust of information, also social interactions and supportive behaviors, and maladaptive responses. So a lot of people compared the wildfire smoke event of the campfire to previous fires or poor air quality in their communities. And so one quote of someone in Fresno, they said, "I think there was a fire in Redding one time. We have fires out here all the time. So whenever you see a fire like that, you smell it, but not as bad like that wildfire. You'll still smell them, but they're faint smell. But the campfire, I think, is the worst I've ever seen since I've been here. I don't think I've ever seen a fire as bad as that. That was really bad." So a lot of people really, I think rightly so, identified the campfire as a very particular extreme event and compared it to other wildfires that they had experienced. In addition, a lot of the folks who live in Fresno did talk about how they felt that the chronic air quality was just as big of an issue for them as the very severe air quality related to the campfire. So they acknowledged that the campfire created a situation that was really bad for them, but they still wanted to talk about how they lived with poor air quality year-round. Almost everyone talked about their sort of constant checking for new and updated information related to air quality. So I don't know if any of you all experienced this. This resonated with me as well. Someone in Sacramento said, "I checked multiple times a day. I knew it wasn't going to change that day. I was also looking at weather a lot, trying to see, is there going to be rain on the horizon? Please let there be rain. I would even look out the window. Maybe it will change soon. Nope, not going to change soon." So I was checking constantly, thinking, I think I was trying to manifest a change in conditions. So I think this is really interesting. I think that a lot of people who reported this behavior, this sort of constant, almost obsessive checking for new information, acknowledged that they weren't going to see any changes. And so that's a really interesting thing that we're observing, that a lot of people were really, potentially for sort of emotional reasons, they felt helpless and were trying to seek a place to get back control. And so that's why they were doing the only thing that they knew how to do, which was check what the air quality was like. So a lot of people talked about sort of their social interactions and the social support that they received and gave during this time. And so a lot of people shared practical information as a helping behavior. So they shared the actual air quality index readings with their friends. One woman said, "I have another mom friend in the neighborhood, and she would text me like, 'Hey, I'm going to head out for a walk.' And I was like, 'No, you can't go outside. The air quality is this number.'" So a lot of people really reported sharing the air quality index number to try to encourage their friends and family to take more care of themselves and really encourage more protective health behaviors in their community. A lot of people also described just sharing experiences with their coworkers and friends and family about how they were feeling and about their health issues. And so this we could sort of interpret as a coping behavior. So really a situation where normally people might not be so intimate and interested in sharing how they were feeling, but it sort of broke down a lot of barriers for people. So This person in Fresno said, I think a lot of it was how we were personally and physically feeling. Have you had a migraine for 2 days? Cool, me too. Or that explains why I have this pressing headache. Stuff like that. So this was a person describing how they were communicating with their coworkers. So I think this is also another interesting sort of finding where we found that people in a way were brought together and were encouraged to share their personal experiences with people that they might not normally. So a little bit about maladaptive responses. So I'm going to focus just on mask use because I think it's something that we can all understand and definitely has some important policy implications. So a lot of people talked about their confusion about how often they should replace masks. So they heard different things. One person said, I heard that if you wore your mask too long, it would no longer be useful. That's part of why I only wore it when I was outside, because once my mask was done, I didn't know if I was going to get a hold of another one. So there were a lot of people who were sort of worried about their mask running out of the ability to filter the air, and also there was sort of a shortage of masks, so fair concern. Another person said, I heard conflicting things about whether masks were a good idea or not. I heard that the air quality inside your mask was worse than breathing the air outside your mask. So this person really was saying they were worried that if the mask was old enough, that the air quality inside could be worse than outside. So definitely we noticed a lot of people mentioning this issue around mask replacement. Some people talked a lot about the discomfort of wearing a mask, and this person talked about how it was like something hot on your face. It's like breathing with a hand over your mouth. It feels like bad air quality. Whereas without the mask, with the smoke, you can at least take a deep breath. So again, just another sort of important indication that people's perceptions of maybe what they were feeling around their mouth or the feeling of the air coming into their lungs was overriding any information that they knew perhaps about what a mask could do to protect their health. And then we did hear a few stories about what we would say as potentially unsafe mask use. And so this person is an asthma sufferer, and so she was taking very good care not to spend a lot of time outside, but she admitted, I did wear masks inside. I wore them in the house. I don't remember if I wore them to sleep. I don't think so, but I did wear them in the house at times. And so it's recommended not to wear a mask indoors, that if your home has really any basic type of air filtration, that the air indoors will be better than the air outdoors, and that a mask can, for asthma sufferers, kind of strain their breathing and can create issues. And this person, it sounds like, was sort of overcompensating by wearing the mask all the time. So, and just a little bit about the findings, these are sort of still in progress, so we are definitely eager to continue analyzing the new interviews that we have. Many of the newer interviews that we have not analyzed yet are with folks who work outdoors. And that's a really important subset of people because we want to learn how people who had no choice but to be outside during this time, potentially people who work in construction, landscaping, or utilities, the types of things that they did to protect their health. So we are wrapping up our interviews, and the next phase of this work is to pilot a survey on an app. And so some of the findings that I've described here will be sort of boiled down into more concise survey questions. And the goal is to eventually conduct a longitudinal survey of a randomized sample of California residents that then could be deployed during the event that there's another wildfire. So if there was, say, a wildfire again in Northern California, we could deploy that survey via an app and then actually get real-time responses from people about the types of things that they're doing to protect their health, the type of information that they're using, and the types of social support that they're providing to their community. And some things I just want to reflect that, this work is very challenging, and in some ways I feel the need to, I guess, sort of admit to the limits of what this type of study can say. And I think one of the challenges for me is that one of my goals is to produce equitable and actionable insights for communities that are most at risk. And so how can policymakers really use this research for good? And I think that because it's very early research, it's difficult to say, but I do think that some of our findings, in particular about maladaptive responses related to mask use, really indicates a gap in how we might communicate to people in California about how to use a mask, where to get a mask. And I think that there are definitely insights that policymakers can draw from this research. And also another goal of mine is to encourage pro-environmental behavior and adaptive responses that really protect human health and conserve sensitive natural resources. But this study really is sort of an observational study, so we're able to describe what people did. We were not attempting to change behavior, and I think that's something I am definitely interested in doing, but the type of study where you use interviews is often really just trying to get that rich, grounded understanding of how people live, and it's difficult to then take that leap to actually change behavior. You want to probably use different methods. And on that note, also, qualitative work takes a lot of time. So it takes a lot of time to schedule interviews with people. Many of these interviews were over an hour long. And then transcribing them and analyzing them takes a lot of time as well. So in some ways, the speed at which this information is reaching the public is slower than we want it to be. I think that, ideally we would have maybe had some results before this most recent fire season, but it's really challenging to get this done quickly. So our goal is to have some more findings and maybe a published paper by the next fire season. And finally, sort of what I alluded to earlier, that this study is just about observed behavior, and it can't actually make claims about what types of health outcomes result from what types of behavior. So definitely another area that I'd like to do more research in, and would require gathering more information from people about their health over time. That's it. Questions?
It seems like the sort of messaging around the health dangers from inhaling smoke and whether to use masks and what other adaptive behaviors would be seems to be changing like radically in the last 5 years. So how much does your study, or how much does the study need to account for how people are responding to information from perceived authorities about how they should protect themselves?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question, because even in this most recent fire season, I was seeing, sort of new ways that local governments were talking to people or sharing information about what types of masks to use, what types of air filters, where you can go and get them. There were sort of a new effort in this most recent fire season to create public spaces that were filtered, and those could have been maybe in a library or a fire station, and there were more and more of those. So yeah, I think it's challenging. In some ideal world, I'd like to go back to all of these people and talk to them over the course of multiple fire seasons and sort of learn how these changes that are happening so rapidly are affecting their behavior. I do think, though, that this sort of snapshot we have in time can still help to inform, in particular, some of the research areas that are really interesting. So sort of how people balance maybe the social cues that they observe around them, what their friends and family are doing and telling them, with the types of information that they might get from a website or the news. So sort of understanding how people trust and use that type of information, can help us target different groups in ways that are the most effective. Yeah.
Going off of that question, did you see any differences regionally in terms of how people were reacting to the fires and whether there were certain communities that wore masks more frequently or didn't, or was there any kind of pattern in that?
Yeah, so I think that there are two things that we noticed. One is that many of the respondents, and so just to also caveat, it's difficult, the sample size is pretty small, so we can't generalize to like the entire region, but one of the dimensions that we selected really intentionally on was this co-exposure to PM 2.5, so sort of whether that community lives with bad air year-round. And we did find that people in Fresno perceived the wildfire smoke to be much less of a risk, and many people did not report wearing masks or taking sort of as many steps or as serious of steps to protect their health. And I think that compared to the group of people that we interviewed in Sacramento and East Palo Alto, many of those folks were very vigilant, described wearing masks. So I think our sort of hypothesis that there is something about being exposed year-round that really lowers your sort of threshold of what's a severe event, and I think also can kind of create that feeling of helplessness over time if your community, if you have to breathe bad air all year round, like they would sort of say, well, it was bad, but it's pretty bad most of the time. So yeah, I think that's one major regional difference that we observed. Yeah.
I remember during the campfire there being some sites that put up "Don't wear a mask, it gives you false start," alerting the community not to wear a mask because it was perhaps giving them a false sense of comfort of being outside. It was better just not to be outside.
Mm-hmm.
And where do you come out on mask? Like, and what is the trusted source for mask usage? Like, should you use a mask or should you not?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, what I know is that science is still sort of evolving, and that it really is sort of group specific. So I don't want to give any recommendations without knowing the most recent thing, but I would say, going to sort of a government source, so likely EPA or CARB or one of the sort of state level sources could tell you the most recent science. But my understanding is there are certain masks that are useful and certain masks that aren't. So the N95 mask, which has a filter and has like a nose clip, that actually can protect you. Something like a surgical mask is basically useless. So that's like a very firm thing that I know. Yeah.
To what extent did you find that economic differences between populations played a role in responses? So, like the people who didn't wear a mask, was it because they didn't want to or because they couldn't afford to get one?
That's a good question. So I haven't done any analysis yet on sort of income levels. So we did ask people, we asked our interviewees about their sort of demographic information. So we asked their race and ethnicity, their education and income. I don't think that emerged to me as a barrier. So a lot of people did report getting masks for free. They were being given out in different places. So I think I would say it's less a concern of whether people were able to afford a mask. Potentially something like an air filter though. Not so many people talked about air filters. I think at this time, during the campfire, there was a little bit less known about that, but I do think now that's something that we want to ask people in our survey is, how much they perceive an air filter to benefit them, and if the cost issue for an air filter is a concern. So an air filter could be, $100 more versus a mask. Many of them are, they were like $5. And I think the other issue around what I would say occupation rather than maybe income is, whether someone works outside. So if you didn't have a choice to take the day off or to work indoors, what types of decisions did people make about their sort of, economic future, and did the wildfire smoke kind of put them in peril economically because of that? Any other questions?
You mentioned the feeling of being trapped or not being able to breathe and maybe staying indoors. Have you seen any connection with mental health issues or however temporary, like reported during these times or reported afterwards?
Yeah, so definitely emotional distress, and I would say reports of depression, what people sometimes call cabin fever, restlessness. A lot of people talked about that as well. And I think that's another topic that in the survey that we plan to do, we'll be focusing on really closely. So we're interested definitely in the health impacts, so the acute health impacts that people experience, things like whether they had sort of a scratchy throat or stinging eyes, but we're also really interested in the sort of mental health impacts. So, whether the being trapped indoors really did affect their mood. And I think there also sort of the awareness in this particular case that it was such a severe fire and that so many people lost their homes, and a lot of people talked about that as well. So maybe they were feeling really distressed and had cabin fever being trapped in their house, but they recognized that that wasn't as bad as actually losing your home. So a lot of people, I think there was some guilt in that as well. So this sort of feeling, oh, I shouldn't complain about the wildfire smoke because at least my community is still standing. And so I think that's another potential barrier to people really, thinking about protecting their health and thinking about the long-term effects of wildfire smoke exposure. Oh, sure, hi.
Hi, so with the continually evolving field of improving masks and air filters and everything, what do you think a policy perspective looks like? Given that it might take some time to implement a policy, would it be about particular use of those types of materials, or would it be more of general staying indoors, or what do you think is most realistic?
Yeah. So I think that finding venues for people to stay up to date on the most recent research about the types of masks that should be worn and by whom. So I think that a role for policymakers is to, is around education and outreach. So I think that's number one, and yeah, definitely finding more opportunities for sort of those communal safe spaces. So a lot of people talked about how if there were places that they knew they could go, then they might have spent more time in those places. So things like that I think are sort of the low-hanging fruit. But yeah, it's really tough, I think, that without sort of the science congealing around one recommendation, the best we can do is sort of share information as we know it. And staying indoors is sort of the number one best recommendation that most health researchers will give to protect your health in a wildfire smoke event. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what were the trusted sources of information? I mean, you mentioned everybody was looking at the air quality index. Did they get that from the local weather person, or was that? Just talk about where they got their information from.
Yeah, so a lot of people talked about going online and going to airnow.gov, which is like a kind of clearinghouse for air quality information at the government level, and Spare the Air, which I believe is a California government website. So those two, a lot of people talked about going to those websites to sort of, and then also a lot of people went to the CAL FIRE website to actually track the fire itself. And we're looking there for information about smoke and smoke forecasts, which was not on that website. So there was, I think, some confusion in a way about where to go, which government website to go to. and how to really find the most up-to-date information. And then a lot of people also reported going to Purple Air. So Purple Air is a private company that has indoor and outdoor air sensors distributed all over California. So you can buy a Purple Air sensor and then you're hooked up to the network and it will share the air quality reading in your location. So a lot of people talked about going to that website also and sort of comparing what they saw on that website to what they saw at some of the government websites. And many times the Purple Air showed the air quality was worse. So it sounded like most people sort of took the higher reading and were more conservative. Yeah. Any other questions? Happy to answer about any of my other research too, or just sort of generally what we plan. Yeah.
Are you doing these interviews yourself?
Yeah, so it's myself and a team of folks. So there were 3 of us who conducted interviews. The colleague that I mentioned earlier, David Gonzalez, who's an EIPER, he conducted a handful of interviews, and also we have a research assistant who conducted some as well. So yeah, it's really interesting too. You know, I think different people have slightly different comfort levels with interviews, and we really worked hard to get on the same page about how we would ask follow-up questions, how we would use the protocol to sort of probe and give people space. So this topic in some ways could seem very easy. It's sort of like, oh, what do you do? What did you do? What do you remember doing? But it also was an emotional sort of interview for some people if they knew people who lived in the Paradise area, or if they were really thinking back on a time that was stressful for them. So yeah, I think we worked well as a team, sort of always debriefing about the interviews that were challenging and how to overcome that. And make the experience as beneficial to everyone as possible. So a lot of people described at the end of the interview feeling like they were motivated to go out and make plans to protect themselves better in the next wildfire event. So they were like, oh, I'm gonna go out and buy some more masks, or change out the air filter in my HVAC unit. So, yeah.
But none of them were motivated to move?
No, we didn't ask explicitly about that, although some people actually talked about, there were a few people in Sacramento who said, I thought someday I might move up to the foothills, but now I don't think I would ever do that. But again, yeah, we were focused on areas sort of intentionally that were not in immediate wildfire risk, the places that were exposed to the smoke sort of exclusively. And that was important to us because obviously the set of decisions around protecting your home and your life from wildfire is sort of a different set of questions and decisions than wildfire.
Did that tie into your work in southeastern Louisiana where you were dealing with communities that were going to disappear? Or anything like that?
Yeah, so that work in Louisiana is a little bit more focused on sort of long-term planning and how people's mobility is impacted by sort of the changing social world around them. And in particular there, it's really about the outmigration of young people to cities and more urban areas, and how that experience is really changing how people think about the future of their place. It's sort of an interesting comparison. I haven't thought about it quite like this, but in some ways Northern California is growing. It's a place where people are moving to, and a lot of these exurban places around Sacramento and Fresno, there's housing developments everywhere. So I think that that's sort of, it's an interesting juxtaposition. California, a place where the economy is booming, people are moving to, are now sort of faced with this environmental risk, whereas in Louisiana, the economy there is really not supporting a lot of population growth, and also facing that environmental risk.
Let's give her another round of applause. Feel free to grab snacks or stick around for questions.